And now we are having our first 20-minute presentation of the first of our experts. David Wright is our friend from our sister organization, the Center for Safer Internet. And they are the center of knowledge in UK concerning the security on the internet. David is a well-known expert, very much involved in preparing a school teacher how to fill the gap between us and the digital world. He's also a member of the UK's Council for Children's Safety. Over to you, David.
Thank you very much. Thank you. A seamless switch over. So it's a pleasure and a privilege. May I thank the organisers, Anna. Thank you very much. It's a privilege to be able to come and talk to you today. So I'm going to be talking to you. If I had the clicker, please. I'm going to be able to talk to you really around online safety. Thank you very much. Online safety, and is it indeed fit for purpose from a school perspective, typically from a school perspective. So I'm from the UK Safer Internet Centre. In the UK Centre is a collaboration, a partnership of three charities, and so we have the same obligations and part of the same fantastic Better Internet for Kids programme across Europe. So in terms of internet safety in a school, the things I'm just going to touch on, and this is something that we've been thinking about very, very recently, is reviewing some of the messages that we use, typically that are used in education of children around online safety. We'll perhaps look at some of the landscape changes. As Stephanie said, things have changed over the course of the 10 years that this conference indeed has been running, but have those messages changed is going to be the question. And then at the end, we're just going to quickly look at school performance, if you like, when it comes to online safety. So in terms of those reliable messages, you may well recognise some of these. You may well be using perhaps some of these messages. Don't share personal information. Think before you post. Check privacy settings. Only friends you know. Don't meet up, and tell a trusted adult. They're the staple, the mainstay perhaps of many education systems, many education programs around online safety. And we've seen, that's been the same perhaps for the last decade. But the only thing that we say is constant with regards to technology is change. And indeed, time has gone by. And so what we're going to do, we're going to go through each of these particular messages and perhaps look at how the landscape has changed and is influencing, and are they still fit for purpose is ultimately the question that we want to indeed to look at. So don't share personal information. Don't share personal information. With social media, the advent of social media, that is the point. The point is to share and to connect people. Facebook's kind of vision and statement is to connect the world. And so not sharing personal information is kind of very much counter to that. And we look at some of the data and research as well that's come out. Some of these messages as well that children can very easily repeat back to you. They're kinds of messages that we're not going to share personal information online. But the question again, in practice, so this is data from Pew Research from February earlier in the year. So it is US data, but I don't think there's going to be necessarily significant change. The vast majority of children are clearly using some form of social media. And so sharing in that context personal data. And is there any surprise about that? Clearly they're growing, they're developing, they're establishing their social presence, their group, they want to be popular. That's a particularly powerful driver, and so clearly there is no great surprise about that. So don't share personal information doesn't really necessarily mean much to them, because clearly it's not coming out in practice. Throughout all of this as well, I'm just going to touch on and look at perhaps some of the modelling that's being done around children as well. And so from an adult's perspective, use of social media or sharing personal data, perhaps, again, this is the same research that Pew published. And so from an adult's perspective, clearly we're very comfortable with sharing personal data when it comes to CCTV, as you can see here, perhaps retail loyalty cards. Some of those cards that often we all walk around with retail, with supermarkets and the like. Conversely as well, they also concluded about some apprehension around sharing personal data when it comes to car insurance and central heating systems, which we can't quite understand, but nonetheless. So much more sophistication we suggest in this context. So the choice, rather than not sharing personal information, it's all around, as Dana Boyd in the States said, scale, audience, and permanency, the durability of data online. So when we're publishing and sharing content, well, who's consuming that? Who is our audience, if you like? Who do we want to see that? It's much more sophistication is required rather than necessarily a blunt, don't share personal information. So moving on, think before you post. Think before you post. Again, a very common statement. And we're going to look at, in this context, look at how the landscape's changed with regards to the device that's typically in probably the majority of your pockets. Smartphones, smart devices, tablet devices. We're increasingly taking images. And so this turns out to be an eye test, doesn't it? We're increasingly taking images. 3/4 of us take and share at least one image a day, again, according to some form of research. And I'm sure many of you will have seen 6% of us sharing those pictures of food and drink, which is clearly what the internet was created for. So 3/4 of us sharing images on a daily basis. And that's a conscious thing to do. But so think before you post, again, is this question. But also now devices have got much more sophisticated in terms of when we do post or when we do take an image, typically the first thing that device will do is it will post that image online itself. If you've got an Apple device, it will post it up to your iCloud. It's the same thing. So thinking before you post, in actual fact, you're not having the opportunity to think before you post because your device has done it for you. Again, thinking about what else has changed. So when you do take an image on your smartphone, that phone will also capture all sorts of other bits of peripheral sensory data and encapsulate that in that image as well. So, and then when you upload it, all that data goes with it too. So it's called Exif Data. So location-based data, for example. So I know perhaps I am posting, I'm thinking before I post an image online, but then all this other peripheral data actually goes alongside that image. There's then all sorts of mapping services that, for example, that will then map those images and then connect those images back to the user. And so from a child safety perspective, clearly you can think about the issues here. We know we posted an image, but are we aware that we're posting all this peripheral data alongside it? And sessions as well, I'm sure, over the course of the next 2 days, looking at the extent of big data. So find one of these mapping services, perhaps find your organisation and find the images that have been posted where you actually particular are. So again, thinking about the sophistication required. Think before you post, again, a little too blunt. So again, who's consuming that information? What information am I actually posting, whether I know about it or indeed whether my device has done it for me? Check privacy settings. Check privacy settings. Again, one thing that we will provide to children, and they'll be able to repeat that message back to you. So we've seen some significant change, have we not, over the course of the last few years around social media in particular. 2 years ago, again, perhaps from a UK perspective, checking privacy settings meant go to your Facebook account because that's where children were. Go to your Facebook account, look at the privacy settings, set it to private. Job done. Don't need to do necessarily anything else. Significant change over that period. And significant change driven in large part from a child's perspective. Again, I'm sure this is pretty common, but from a UK perspective, the age and sex of those joining Facebook most at the moment are women over 55. The consequence of that is that Facebook, from a UK perspective, is no longer necessarily the place. It's a cool place to be, wherever your mam or your nan is. That might not translate, by the way. Whether your mother or your grandmother is, it's not necessarily the place to be. And so a real broad set of social media services being used. As well, you'll all be familiar with logging into services using your Facebook or your Google or your Twitter, whatever login. So you only need to remember one password. It's very convenient. But what that is doing is it builds a connection between the services that you use and those Facebook or Google services. And so checking privacy settings now becomes a big mesh, as you can kind of see here, as you build the use of services and then make those connections between them. So checking privacy settings is becoming almost, we suggest, impossible, especially when some services don't have privacy settings. Some of the new sort of services that are coming on stream, especially anonymous-based commenting services, don't have any form of privacy settings. When we add into the mix then as well, personal mobile devices, smartphones, tablets, and the like, Apple, Android, Windows devices too. A great example here. A great example is WhatsApp. Just kind of a show of hands. How many of you do use WhatsApp? There's the translation coming in. Thank you very much. Excellent. So it's a great example. It's a great example. Is WhatsApp. Incidentally, this is so I use WhatsApp. This is not a go, but it's just a beautiful example of the point I'm going to make. So those of you who do use WhatsApp, I ask you the question: well, why do you use WhatsApp? And you're probably now thinking to yourself, well, David, I use it because it's free. And we all love stuff that's free, do we not? But again, I ask you this question: why is it free? And again, from a child's perspective, this is a lovely question to ask. Well, why is it free? Is it actually free? Because make no mistake, if you do access or use a service online that's free, you are the product. And somehow there will be a way of generating money to sustain the whole service. So from a WhatsApp perspective, that is often around data. And there's typically three ways that a service will generate money. One is data, advertising, or indeed in-app purchases, which is typically the three ways they'll generate money. So with WhatsApp, you download, you accept the terms and conditions, which again, obviously you all diligently read, and then what you have to then provide access to contact details. Again, building this big, adding into this mesh and complexity around your own digital use, connecting services together and connecting devices into that as well. So always thinking about what that access actually is. We're always fixated on downloading or accessing the app that's free. We always then tick the box that says accept terms of service, conditions of use, or terms and conditions, should I say. But always do spend a moment. There will be a reason why something's free. This particular infographic just highlights the extent. So 3/4 of apps do require some form of data, sensory data from your device, typically location-based data. And so the question then comes is, well, how are they going to use that? How are they going to protect, indeed, your privacy and what is your personal data? So checking privacy settings, we suggest, is now much more of a state of mind rather than necessarily anything that you can apply. I mentioned terms of service there, terms and conditions. So again, those hurdles that you've got to get over, that everyone reads clearly those terms and conditions, he says with a tongue-in-cheek. Typically, it's just a lovely infographic highlighting some of the terms and conditions. In April 2010, Facebook were rightly criticised for the length of their terms and conditions were longer than the US Constitution, and so clearly have made some changes since. But also in terms of the level of education required to read, interpret and understand those is typically a college graduate. So they're written in clearly in such a way. You'll all be familiar with some of the wording, I'm sure. Another lovely example of terms and conditions is Apple. And I'm sure many of you use Apple device, so therefore we'll use iTunes. And I'm just going to read you. This just makes some of perhaps the strange elements that appear in some terms and conditions. I'm going to read you an extract from the standard iTunes terms and conditions. So that's clearly for use of digital services, about apps, music, films. And if you do use Apple device, then you will have accepted these terms and conditions for what are digital services. Have a look, just have a search for iTunes terms and conditions. I'd say it just makes this point. So it says, you also agree that you will not use these products for any purposes prohibited by United States law, including without limitation the development, design, manufacture or production of nuclear, missile or chemical or biological weapons. So if you do use iTunes, you can't use it to create a nuclear or biological weapon. It makes the point about how strange some of these terms and conditions actually are. And the devil is always in the detail. This particular website actually hasn't been updated for a year or so, but tried to classify and summarize some of the terms of service, the more popular terms of service that indeed are in use. It is important. It is particularly important when we're using services and understanding how they will be using our data, especially if they're free. So whilst it may be difficult to read terms and conditions, I would very much encourage people, if only to skim read them, but don't just simply tick the box and move on. Something we're always trying to provide to children with. So moving on, only friends you know. You should only be friends with people online who you know. These are just a couple of examples of social media network analysis mapping tools. In fact, the image on the right here is something that Facebook posted, and it exemplifies the connections between people. It maps the connections between people. So clearly a global platform. And the whole term around the word friend has changed, in large part by Facebook. Friend from a child's perspective is, from an adult's perspective, clearly someone you have a physical or an emotional connection with, whereas from an online perspective, it is merely just a connection. So the definition, the fundamental definition indeed has changed. We do see that children will use various different social media services to connect with different communities and groups. So they'll use it in that particular way. Perhaps I'll talk to my family with one provider, or I'll talk to my friends with Snapchat, or other friends with Instagram. So they create communities around particular services. And so that's, again, more sophistication rather than you shouldn't be friends. You should only be friends with people with whom you know. But it's about who those particular people are, managing them in accordingly, I think. Things have moved on. The messages, again, perhaps haven't. More sophistication required. This one as well. Don't meet up. Don't meet up with someone that you met online. With this one, we thought more around what are the behaviours that are being modelled around children. So whilst children may well be able to, again, bark back and tell you, don't meet up with somebody, what are those behaviours that perhaps parents are doing, are modelling? And so just some data, some highlighting data. This came from a collection from eHarmony, dating sites online. And there's the point, that many parents may well be modelling using some social media or using online services to meet people, dating services. That may be the behaviour that children are being exposed to at home. And so that's the sort of behaviour that they will therefore adopt. There are some various different numbers around. This particularly does make the point. I saw one bit of research that claimed that 1 in 4 young married couples in the States, of young people, met online. So clearly there comes a point at which it's okay to meet up online. But it's more around, again, those behaviours that are being modelled around children. I thought I'd include this in here as well, just an example. So it's not just children that lie online. This research as well concluded the sorts of things that adults typically lie about online, especially on dating sites. Men particularly lying about age, height, income, women lying about weight, physical build, and indeed age. It's not just solely children who clearly will bend the truth perhaps a little online. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not suggesting for one moment that 5-year-olds should be using Match.com or using dating services, but it's more the point that those are the sorts of things that may well be being modelled at home, and therefore those are the sorts of behaviours that they will therefore adopt. And so thinking about how more sophistication, again, I think in terms of that particular message. When does it become okay? How do you do it in a safe manner when you do perhaps become a teenager? It needs to be much more age appropriate, perhaps. This one, tell a trusted adult, the final one in this particular section. Tell a trusted adult if you have a particular issue. Now, I'm just going to highlight some research we did about 5 years or so ago, looking at particularly at sexting. And one of the questions we asked was, this was of 1,130 teenagers, 1,100 teenagers. One of the questions we asked was, if you had a problem, who would you go and talk to? And the vast majority, 74% of them would only ever talk to a friend. They knew the messages to tell a trusted adult, but the only person they would actually tell is a friend. And so that kind of got us thinking, why is that? Because that's clearly wrong. How do we change that? How do we change that? Why do we have that sort of situation? So we concluded, particularly of teenagers, perhaps that they only will talk to friends because perhaps adults, they don't perceive or don't think that adults understand their issues. They'll perhaps just remove access and connectivity from them. So the reaction that they'll get is perhaps part of the issue. And so, how can we change that? What do we need to do? And so it's enabling a range of different opportunities for children to tell you something. Whether it's online, perhaps use online services, social media in one form or another, using more sophisticated mechanisms for you to be able to receive a report from a child. Do it perhaps in an anonymous way, so they can tell you something perhaps quietly. A range of things. So the landscape clearly has changed. Stephanie made this point to start with. 10 years, a decade has gone by. The landscape has changed in such a broad set. So broader set of social media services. Children are universally, constantly connected. It's not we go online anymore. We're connected all the time. And thinking about as well the role modelling. Adults, we are increasingly using some form of social media or online services now, and so that's becoming modelled as well within children's behaviour too. So we need to think, and I would encourage you all to think about the message you provide to children and make them in tune with how children use technology. It's insufficient just to enable them to bark back and to repeat the message you give them. Is how it then comes out into practice. I just want to, for a minute, just look at school performance. This particular slide is the result. So we have we publish an annual State of the Nation assessment around school policy and practice when it comes to online safety. And the data is derived from something called 360 Degrees Safe. It's an online tool that schools in the UK, indeed today 10,000 schools in the UK, it's about 1 in 2 schools use. It prompts 28 different questions and enables a school to assess where they're actually at in whether we're around policy or their infrastructure or their education program or their training programs. Enables them to assess where they're at, but it also then discloses to us as a nation where schools are at as a collective. And so we conclude that, as it was actually published by Plymouth University, that schools are strung around filtering and policy. Consistently the weakest area, the ones down here, are all to do with staff training. schools within the UK spend more time training parents than they do their own staff. That is clearly an issue. And I asked them the capability of the teaching workforce to be able to support children and understand, if you like, understand their world, support them, educate them through all of these particular issues. So in conclusion, is internet safety in school fit for purpose? In some ways it is, and I'm sure in many schools that we have exemplary practice, but in lots of them, I would very much encourage all of you to think about some of the messages that you do provide children and make sure, like I said earlier on, that they are in tune with how children use technology rather than necessarily them telling you all these particular messages, because they don't necessarily come out, I think, in practice. That's the thing I would leave you with. Think about your own messages, about how you educate children. And with that, I'm done.